This comparison just occurred to me because I've just been looking at the beast on the left, which is a Zebra Fang from Tomy, and it's effectively, I believe, a direct copy of a Zoid of a much earlier era from the mid-80s. But this chap on the right here is a Starrior, also by Tomy, also from the mid-80s. And as you can see, there is a certain familiarity between the two of them. And if I show you these, can you tell me which one is a Zoid gun as opposed to a Starrior gun? It's a pretty tough call to make, isn't it? In fact, only this one is a Zoid gun. But you can see that exactly the same principles are applying in terms of how they fit on. They just fit onto pegs. And in fact, when I first saw this one, I actually could have sworn that this was from a Zoid rather than from being a Starrior. Now, the Starriors came pre-made. This guy is completely as he came out of the box, basically. But he's got some little features like having a sort of concealed gun inside his mouth and so on, which is quite Zoid-like. The Zoids would definitely pull that sort of trick to conceal weaponry. And he's got a bit of a sort of an opening mouth there as well, and so on. Some of the other Zoids did that sort of thing. And you can see that both are based loosely on, sort of quadrupeds from Earth. But it is quite fascinating. The size-wise are very, very similar as well. And there was a component in the Starriors in terms of the robots that actually sort of piloted them. They had little controlling figures, which are supposed to be their brains because they're supposed to be robots as a whole rather than necessarily being piloted. But you could tell that there was definitely a sort of a Zoid design element to both of them on that basis. Whereas, it's kind of difficult to classify Zoids because they're not robots in their own sense. If you take the android out of a Zoid, it basically doesn't go anywhere. So the Zoids don't seem to be sentient in and of themselves, and yet they do seem to have a sort of symbiotic relationship with their android, which implies that they're quite complex organisms and perhaps not entirely sort of mechanical creatures in and of themselves. So I guess we would call them mecha, in our sort of way of classifying these things, in the sense that they are driven rather than being sentient and robotic in their own sense. But there's a bit of a question mark there. And the irony is, not even if they are mecha, they're actually robot-controlled mecha. So they're not even, they're not piloted in the traditional sense that you tend to see in anime series where the pilot is a humanoid, but a biological humanoid. They're actually controlled by other robots. So, it's all kind of convoluted, I suppose. But I just thought it was an interesting comparison to sort of see them alongside. Even though this one's obviously a much later model, it is exactly the same mould, I believe, as the mid-80s Zoids were. So it's just kind of interesting to see them alongside each other. And, the thing is that the Starrior's on rollers, so it's not like this is a sort of, it's not really got a sort of walking mechanism to it. It's simpler than that. But when it does move, it does do other things at the same time. So there is something structural going on in there. It's just a lot hardier than the Zoids because the Zoids are quite breaky and you do lose stuff off them. But the Starrior does have a lot of some modification possibilities. But then the Zoids could swap their weapons between themselves as well. If you could remember which ones were the original ones to start with, of course. This should incidentally goes on his sort of shoulder here, so that just slots straight back on there. So, they're easy enough to reattach, but they're fix any more than the Starriors are. But again, it just gives you a degree of customization. But of course, the Zoids parts have to go where they have to go in order for the Zoid to actually be able to move in a convincing fashion. So you can't really mix and match. It wasn't that sort of set, but at least the weapons could be swapped to a certain extent if you could find one with the right sized peg. So I just thought it was an interesting comparison between two quite distinct lines from Tomy, which nevertheless have this sort of slight echoes of each other in them. So it going to show you something a little bit bigger next. Cheers for now.